Now, I think this is important because you get Sharia law Ted chiming in on whether the federal government basically should be able to make a uniform policy regarding adoption and same-sex marriage. And Ted punts on this one, basically really pushing the answer to that question down to the states. Now, my question is this. Adoption maybe not that much of a major issue, because if you're in a state, if you live in a state where the adoption laws do not favor same-sex marriage, and by the way, I'm not into that either, so to be honest with you, I think adoption should be by two, a mother and a father, and not two people of the same sex. And that's just my personal opinion. You can rail against it, but that's my opinion. I have mine, you have yours. But the side as far as marriage is concerned, and again, I'm not into gay marriage, but I do recognize that if there are laws that allow a person's marriage, whether heterosexual or homosexual, to be recognized in one state, that's something that needs to be recognized across the board in every state. Otherwise, you basically are going to have chaos.
Senator Cruz, the U.S. Supreme Court obviously declared same-sex marriage legal in all 50 states, a decision you have criticized. Given the current status of the law, do you believe a gay couple should be able to adopt?
Well, listen, adoption is decided at the state level, and I am a believer in the 10th Amendment in the Constitution. I would leave the question of marriage to the states. I would leave the question of adoption to the states. That's the way it's been for 2 centuries of our nation's history, until 5 unelected judges in an illegitimate and wrong decision decided to seize the authority over marriage and wrongfully tear down the marriage laws of all 50 states. Now,
okay, and using that same argument, 5 unelected Supreme Court justices, that's the purpose of the Supreme Court. But I'm interested in hearing what he has to say about the Dred Scott case, because it was those same unelected judges that basically decided that slavery basically was illegal. So you can't basically have it both ways, because he would turn around and say, well, they made a mistake. But he's holier than thou as far as his opinion. Anytime the Supreme Court decides for an issue that he's in favor of, they're the greatest thing since sliced bread. And every time they decide against an issue that he's for, they become the unelected Supreme Court justices that are making mistakes. You can't have it both ways, Ted.
Integrally connected to this is the question of religious liberty. And at the last debate, one of my colleagues on this stage said on the question of religious liberty and Supreme Court nominees that he'd be willing to compromise and negotiate. I can tell you, for me, there are areas that we should compromise on. Marginal tax rates, we can reach a middle ground on. But when it comes to core principles and convictions, when it comes to the Constitution and Bill of Rights, I can tell the men and women at home, I will never compromise away your religious liberty.
Now, that being said, in order to confirm a Supreme Court justice, you need 60 votes in the Senate, or a supermajority. Using Ted Cruz's logic, we will never ever be able to appoint another Supreme Court justice, because in order to appoint one, some Republicans or some Democrats are going to have to compromise on their views of the Supreme Court nominee. Because until there are 60 Republicans or 60 Democrats in the Senate, compromise is going to be required.
And for me, Brett, religious liberty has been a lifelong passion. I've spent 2 decades defending religious liberty, including defending the 10 Commandments before the U.S. Supreme Court and winning, defending the Pledge of Allegiance before the Supreme Court and winning, and defending the Mojave Desert Veterans Memorial, a lone white Latin cross that was erected to honor the men and women who gave their lives in World War I. I represented 3 million veterans for free
Senator,
defending that memorial, and we won 5-4 before the Supreme
Senator, thank you.
And that's just another way of saying Ted Cruz is for Sharia Christian law.